Hi, I'm Crystal, and I'm here to talk to you about viable remote work options. Now, real quick, we have our work styles that we're going to go over as they pertain to this. On-site is that traditional work where you would work in an office or wherever your workplace may be. Remote is you are working from home or any other third location. And then we have hybrid, which is a combination of the two. Now, we saw during quarantine a lot of workplaces suddenly move to a remote work model. So we see that technology has increased to the point that it is possible. However, now that the quarantine period is ended, a lot of workplaces are trying to move back to on-site only models. They are calling for a return to normal. Well, that shouldn't be the case. It would benefit everyone that this remote work option stayed available to any employees. And I will be making that case, but first we do need to define what work is viable for this. You can't do every job from home, at least not currently. So I want to clarify what sort of positions we're not talking about when we say that remote work should be a standard practice. We're not going to be able to do that for physical labor, be that construction, farming, cleaning. We can't do that for transportation, like truck driving or flying an airplane. And we also can't do it for most customer service jobs, at least not the ones where the entire point really is that you're there, be that as a waiter or a clerk. You could still make jobs such as call centers remote, but a lot of those positions are going to require physically being there. Of course, I do encourage regularly checking back on the standards of what is considered viable or not viable as technology improves and jobs are created that we didn't even think of, so that we don't end up in a situation like with Uber where, well, technically they can do a lot of things because we didn't account for this specifically. For remote work itself, I'm going to talk about some of the benefits that it brings and a lot of the concerns that are probably coming to mind. On that benefit end, it was a huge boom for employees, and there was an overall preference for remote work, whether it was fully remote or hybrid. A lot of those employees, they found virtual meetings were less stressful. They wanted to work by themselves if they were going to be really productive. There was an improvement in work-life balance. People were exercising more. You could make healthier foods for your lunch. It was great in a lot of ways. In addition to that improvement to physical and mental health, it was also improving time and money because no one had to physically commute to work. You didn't have to buy as much gas as before, and you saved, on average, 8.5 hours a week or 408 hours a year. And if that continued to be a standard, that would widen the scope of how far away you could live from the place you work. So you wouldn't be limited by, well, where can I get to in a reasonable amount of time, especially if you don't have easy access to personal transportation. On the business half of that, we also saw that businesses with those remote policies, they saw a faster rate of revenue growth. It was just more cost effective to run work remotely. The teams working for them, the ones who would set up their hybrid policy, they had a higher rate of employee engagement. The return to office mandates that we're seeing, they've shown no financial benefits so far. So while that is one of the main arguments made for why we need to return to the office, it's not holding up. The only real figure that we've seen change is a decline in employee satisfaction after those mandates. Now, what are some of the other concerns with it, since the money aspect clearly isn't actually there? Well, the biggest one for workers is a level of proximity bias. If there is a mix between remote and in-person workers, favorability is going to fall to those on-site workers because, well, they're there. The managers and those in charge can see them. They can see their contributions, and they're more present in their mind. This has resulted in a pay disparity and really fewer promotions going to those remote workers. And a lot of the demand for office work that we've seen, it's not a financial thing. it's more of a control thing, the dreaded micromanaging, some to more extremes than others. But nonetheless, it's one of those things that it feels like it's doing harm, but really, the main harm is coming from those negative perceptions. To be clear, remote work is not ideal for everyone. There are workers who genuinely do not thrive in remote work conditions, just as there are workers who do not thrive in on-site conditions. Maybe a worker is not very technologically savvy and they don't like having to sign into these VPNs and figure out how to use the sign-in portal and all these extra steps. They just want to go to the office and do their job. That is a very fair concern for that employee to have, which is why we don't want to have only remote work, we just want it as an option. On the employer perspective of that, there's a non-uniform internet service question. What services do all of your employees use? How strong are their connections? Is the problem with their internet, or is it something that they're doing wrong? It's harder to tell when it's not all within one internal system. And there's also just general concerns of how this would affect pricing and the internet as a utility, and a lot of other talking points that aren't directly a matter of remote work, so we are going to put a big old pin in that for another day. Now, most of the research on remote work is very closely intertwined with the quarantine and all of that going on. So for things such as loneliness or the poor implementation, it's hard to tell to what degree it was genuinely a matter of the remote work, if it was employees who would not have wanted to be in remote work positions being in those positions by force, and how much of it is also external stressors from those quarantine conditions, like not being able to socialize really outside of work, aside from those people in your own home, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of variables in there, and it's very hard to tell where the numbers lay. For the business half of that, a lot of those dips came about from workplaces that didn't really have a plan established. We saw a much easier shift from companies that already had some form of remote work plan. So the main takeaway is that it is implied, at least from the numbers, that a lot of the drawbacks of remote work are either a matter of personal preference, just like with on-site work, a matter of a poor mindset, such as the proximity bias concern, or just a matter of poor planning. Almost nothing turns out great if you do it last minute. Remote work is not special in that regard. Well, why aren't we just doing hybrid? Isn't that the best of both worlds? Why remote work specifically? Well, hybrid is fantastic in a lot of ways. For most people, it's going to be the best option. With an ideal rate being found of 1 to 2 days in the office and the rest of the work week being remote, we have seen employees have more flexibility, but they don't feel as isolated as they did in remote work, at least as we've seen thus far. This would also allow for easier short-term uses of remote services. So maybe you have a dangerous commute because it snowed. Maybe you have a slight cold, so you don't want to get anyone else sick, but you don't need to take a whole day off. Maybe you just need to be home to let a service worker in at a certain hour. Maybe you need to look after someone else for the day. Maybe you have broken both your legs and your office is on the 6th floor and the company elevator is broken. Whatever the case, there is now a system in place to let you continue on with as little interruption as possible. So why not hybrid? Well, because for people who that disability is more than temporary, a hybrid work model is no more accessible than those traditional on-site work models. Anyone can become disabled at any time. Maybe you've gotten into an accident, maybe you had a condition that had been lying dormant, maybe you've just gotten older. But the point is, it's always there. It's always a possibility. And even if you are not personally affected by this, we should still care about everyone who is. Okay, so why don't we just make remote work a disability accommodation and leave it at that? Well, that compounds a lot of the issues solely on disabled workers. That proximity bias would now be specifically affecting them, or at least disproportionately compared to hybrid workers. The infrastructure for remote work might not be as well integrated with the on-site workers, or it might just be kept in generally subpar conditions because, well, not a lot of employees are using it. It doesn't come up very often. But that is also further incentivizing anyone in charge of hiring to not hire those disabled workers that would necessitate being more on top of that. Well, isn't that illegal? Yes, it absolutely is. But it can be very difficult to prove that the reason you weren't hired is because you are disabled and the company wasn't ready for that, versus any other reason that they might give. It's a losing battle. In its ideal form, standardized remote work options function like public wheelchair ramps. It's necessary for those who need it, and for those who don't, it's unobtrusive or even beneficial. Like if you need to push something heavy, or you have a baby stroller, or you've temporarily broken your leg, you're still benefiting from that. And even if you don't need it, it's not hurting you. Okay, well, what do we do about this? Well, we don't make remote work the only option. That doesn't help anyone any more than making on-site the only option does. It's benefiting all of us, though, so we should make remote work a standard part of the working world. We have to do more research. We need information that isn't so closely tied to COVID. At the very least, we need better disability protections for remote work as an accommodation. But the bigger end goal is that after we do sufficient further research and know that ideal plan, we can implement wider laws that make this standard for everyone. Thank you for your time.